So finally, and I'm not going to show all of this because we've got pages and pages of Figma and Sketch things going on and little time. But the other, so you remember last time we talked about how the service is made up of components. It's like these Lego-like components of different types of data we get from people. So just to let you know, that's the development. We're going away and beginning to build those Lego blocks, and so this is it's just a kind of video showing that John made, showing some of those very ugly components beginning to get built. But you remember this idea of we're building these components. But going back to the key foundational questions of this project in the original thing, which Yemi was touching on earlier, one of the question 5 here is this question of how can we ensure that such a long content-heavy digital service is legible and navigable for users? Because it's that classic thing of, on one level, we're focused on how digital can really improve the planning process, but equally, every solution creates new problems. And one of the problems we can easily foresee is this issue. So we're doing some thinking about how do those Lego components, how are they going to kind of appear on a screen, if you like, and put themselves in the user's way. So we don't have fixed idea, but I'm just going to kind of share some of these, which are some of our design thoughts on this as an overall approach. As I say, this is question 5. It is not the most central question of this project, but I think it is an interesting thing for us to be exploring. So the standard kind of classic thing, the kind of format you would expect for kind of a digital service like this, and in most cases, is something like this, where you have a web page, you often have your kind of banner and your council logo or whatever at the top, and then you have a series of your fields using the gov.uk patterns, and then you submit. That's obviously fine for short services, but obviously beyond a certain length of service, and when the questions start getting dynamic, it feels really kind of claustrophobic and illegible. And you can, I think, SMPA, what you can see, look at Hackney, it was to some extent mitigated by the skill of Snook. They have really, really good designers, but you could already begin to feel that sort of stretching, pushing at the edges of what felt a bit too long. Of a thing, and we're like, okay, that's a really interesting challenge. So the classic kind of next sort of approach to that is something like this, where you do create a series of legible steps, and this might be something that we can employ. This is a kind of classic web pattern where you have predefined steps to do this, and even some shopping baskets, even though the private sector has got really, really good at minimizing the number of clicks by the time you check out. Even some shopping baskets will do this now, where there's a bit more information required. But even that, particularly on mobile, I think might begin to feel a little bit stretched and illegible, especially if you're introducing the dynamic components that potentially the steps to do or the questions to ask are changing in response to what you're answering. So obviously, as you know, we've already been exploring, and we've shared this work for this idea of a kind of fluid-like interface, and we've seen a few insurance services and private sector people, like Typeform is a really good example of this, where it's not a chatbot as such, but it's sort of almost asking 1 or 2 questions at a time, and it's much more conversational. And this is actually one of the kind of design frameworks we're using for this. Is if you imagine the user experience is coming into the council office and sitting with an officer, and some of the stuff is going to be the officer asking them questions and talking them through, and sometimes it's going to be the officer asking them to fill in a form. Let's differentiate between those 2 voices, if you sort of mean, as a design experience. So the first kind of what we call the fluid thing, or that very much suits the kind of voice, what you would expect a person to ask you, and you can respond in a responsive way. The same design principles apply in terms of, in each case, the content is the content, but actually we can customize it to each council can style this how they like. All you really need is a color and a logo, and you're away. You do also need to have your own separate privacy notice in the corner, but we won't go into that. So what we're beginning to explore is the idea of whether we can actually hybridize, the best ways of hybridizing those two and having the best of both those two approaches. The idea that maybe what you would, this kind of concept here, where essentially you would be answering a series of questions to triage your way into a service, and then once you arrive at a form, it's like a card that's coming up, and you're doing your thing, and then you're going, okay, I'm ready to move on. But also the user can scroll quite seamlessly back and forward, and so they can see what's already been done. So they kind of get a sense that they're in an interface that they're in control of. And we'll see whether this works, and it's something we're going to keep exploring and thinking about. What the right thing is to do. It might be that this really doesn't work, and we actually need it to be more like the kind of named steps sort of approach. And of course, then within this, things like this. So we already showed this previously. This component of a structured form which has multiple sections, and so this is one of the things that, again, hopefully user testing will help. This is where users are like, well, sometimes knowing your progress through a service is irrelevant information, right? Because it's just it's just the next thing they're going to ask me. Whereas actually, when you're filling out a form or something like that, you really, really want to know, like, oh, how much is left? How long is this going to take, etc., etc. So, and again, this is actually it's like an early beta one, but this is one of the gov.uk patterns, which is really good. And then I mentioned this before. Again, we're just beginning to look at what that My Applications dashboard might begin to look like. Really stripped back. What's the essential bits of information that the user will need to know there, etc., etc. So all that's to be explored, but that's essentially kind of what I thought was worth us sharing, was both that we're looking at the individual Lego blocks, but then, if you like, looking at the, like that big Lego map, like the environment where all these blocks play out. And I think we will hopefully get some insight on what feels right when we come to do some user testing.
Great, thanks, Alistair.